الحمد لله حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه مباركا عليه كما يحب ربنا ويرضى جل جلاله وعم نواله والصلاة والسلام على سيد الحبيب المصطفى صلى الله تعالى عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم تسليما كثيرا إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. This is a risala that of one of the mashayikh of the tariqah, Hazrat Khaja Yusuf Hamadani. He's one of the great mashayikh of the tariqah, and a number of his rasail, his small. So this is a number of his rasail, and I found one of them to be, I haven't read all of them, but the one I found it to be a very succinct nasiha that he's providing, which covers many aspects, but it serves as a reminder, inshallah, for these things. So the first thing he starts with is very important, and this is the secret of the path. Being in association with the Shaykh is probably one of the most important aspects, because otherwise worship you can do for yourself. Why choose to be in a tariqah if you can't be with your Shaykh? Right? That's kind of the point, that it's to get the suhbah, because when you're in that company, then the Shaykh will also be in that mode of irshad, and then there's the benefit. So being in a majlis is extremely useful. So that's why he says, जो मुरीद पीर की सोहबत से महरूम हुआ, उसे चाहे कि हर रोज़ उन बुज़ुर्गों के मलफूज़ात की 8 औराक मुताला करे, ताकि ये मलफूज़ात उसके क़ल्बी ग़िज़ा का सबब बने. If somebody is unable to be with their Shaykh, because you're too far away or for whatever reason, anybody who's close, there's no excuse. To be honest, that is the secret of the path, to be in the gathering, because the spiritual rejuvenation you get there from the collective adhkar that take place in that is what we really benefit from. So if somebody can't, then they should read at least 8 pages of the ahwal of any mashayikh, so biographies. In Urdu there's many, in Arabic there's many, in English there's not as many yet, but that is that will be you can say, the replacement until they can go and visit the Shaykh again, because without that it's just a connection in which there's no life. The life can only come when you make that connection. That's very important, because that's what gives the benefit for the rest of the week, the rest of the month, or whatever it is too. Then he says that there are 3 things. There are actually 4 things that a person has to stay very steadfast on. One is, of course, khahishat of the nafs. The desires of the heart have to be opposed. They have to be opposed all the time. That's going to be a constant problem, and that's why it's a constant reminder, because that is one thing which is always going to be something we contend with, right, as we know. So that's why this is being mentioned over and over. And now, one thing he says, which is very interesting, is that the way you do it is, number 1, your speech, your food, and your clothing must be according to need only, not just to fulfill desire. So that takes away the need for going and doing too much shopping for no reason. It needs to be, if you got a need for a new garment, then yes, go and get a good garment. But don't get another garment just because your heart desires it and you don't need it. First get rid of the other garment, then maybe go and get another one. Give it to the poor. That's your sadaqah, that's done. Then go and get another one. So to balance that durura and personal satisfaction, additional, that's something a lot of us, and because it's halal to buy more, it's halal, it's not haram, is it? That's where, and because the whole world today is about style and getting the latest things, we also get caught up in that. How do you balance that? That's a very difficult thing to do. But this is the point. This is a very important point, because the more you indulge the nafs in even halal things, the more it's gonna rear its head. Then he says, if it's sufficient for you to eat 1 time in a day, then make that sufficient. he's speaking, obviously we might think this is so strange because we're so used to eating 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch and supper, or 2 times a day at least. But obviously when he's saying once a day, don't think that he doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, this is the case in many parts of the world. They only get 1 time food. That's all they get. And then he says, when you do eat, don't fill your stomach. Because he says that if a person doesn't control their desires in these things, then they will eventually be destroyed spiritually. Until the nafs doesn't become obedient to the person, then shaitan can never stay at a distance, because that's the internal associate of shaitan that he uses inside us. So if we can't get a grip on the nafs, then try as much against the shaitan. We've got an inside and an inside man. Shaitan is an inside man. So deal with the nafs, and the shaitan will not have an inside, and it's going to be much more difficult for him. Then you have to just deal with him like an external enemy. Otherwise you have to deal with him as an internal enemy. But we don't even know that. We still think he's external, yet he's got a guy sleeping inside the house. Number 2, he also talks about khalwa, which means to be alone for a while. And to do this, whenever a person can. From this you get your heart is allowed to have sukoon again. When you're constantly with people, it's being attracted in all different directions. Unless of course you're always with good people. But even then, within the good people, it's not all you're hardly ever going to be among awliya, like complete awliya. That's why the famous thing about Shaykh Ilyas rahmatullah alayhi, that he used to, even after the ijtima'at, he used to go and do khalwa. That's that he knows what he's doing. He's a Sufi. He knows what he's talking about. Otherwise, who would think it's even any kind of reasonable sense to go from an ijtima that is such a iman boosting thing, and it is no doubt, and then insist that I have to go in khalwa for a few days? Where would somebody come up with that from? Anybody who is not initiated, they think that this is like an affront to being in an ijtima. What's the problem with an ijtima? But the ijtima, there's a certain benefit of iman boosting, but at the same time, it's a lot of ikhtilat. And ikhtilat is not, everybody's not a wali in there. So your hearts attract each other, hearts influence each other. So subhanallah. So that's why try to go into somewhere. So whenever there's an opportunity to do an i'tikaf, I mean, unfortunately our i'tikafs are not proper i'tikafs anymore. They're still better than being outside because you're still with believers, but there's no real khalwa in our i'tikafs because we sit and we talk. And I mean, there are, mashallah, Mawlana Salim's i'tikaf is very good, where it insists that it's not discussion with anybody. So that's another thing. And just generally throughout the year, you can't just wait until Ramadan and get everything then, and then, you have to do this over time. So whenever there's an opportunity to do something like this, or just stay at home one day, don't go out. Just stay at one home and just focus on your own good things. That could be done as well. Then the other thing he talks about is don't sleep too much. And he's quite generous because he takes from Imam Ghazali. Imam Ghazali actually mentions this in his Bidayatul Hidayah as well, that he says you can't sleep for more than 8 hours. 8 hours is absolute max. Because he says that even if you look at 8 hours, if a person has slept 8 hours, then that means he slept 1/3 of his life. Now if you look at 8 hours a day, it doesn't sound too much, but when you think about 1/3 of your life you spent sleeping, that does sound a lot. Of course, if a person is doing evil, then it's good to be sleeping for 1/3 of your life. Then at least that's that much less. But if you want to be productive and you want to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then baad mein to maza hi karna hai, then there's no point doing the sleep in this world. But then also they say don't sleep too little until you actually can get very used to it. Otherwise that will make you khabith al-nafs. That will make you feel feel miserable. Then you can't do worship. So mujahada has to be done according to step-by-step process. If somebody jumps into the deep end from before, it's going to actually make them feel miserable. Because they're going to feel hungry if they've been trying to abstain from food. It's going to make them feel sleepy. It's going to make them feel weak. The body, there's a body that has to go along with your spiritual state. Otherwise, the body will rebel and make you feel miserable. And when you feel miserable, then you can't really put your heart in worship. So, that everything has to be done. You have to train. You can't jump from one extreme to the other. We don't have the mental capacity, and the body doesn't allow it. The body rebels. So you have to go according to the biology of the body and train slowly. And the good thing about the body is that it can be trained to do these things. So that's why anybody who jumps into the deep end without training themselves to do it, they will generally find out that it will backfire. Right? And then you lose everything. That's why you have to take it easy. You have to allow the nafs. If you've had a life of nafsi pleasures, then you have to allow it some permissible pleasure once in a while. And slowly, slowly you start dealing with it. Number 3, he says, halal eating, food and clothing. And he says that's such an important thing that with haram you will be bereft and deprived of any form of nur that's supposed to come in your heart. And that's exactly what we are looking for, nur of the heart. So if a person eats haram or wears haram, basically haram income, that's where it's going to come from, right? I mean, because anybody who's on the path is not going to eat haram. Haram yani haram. But the source is what he's probably speaking about here. Because that's where we make the mistake. So in that case, the heart will never gain any nur, and you will never have pleasure in your worship. Because pleasure in the worship comes from having this additional nur. Otherwise we'll do worship but we'll never have the pleasure of it, because pleasure has to come from the nur. The nur is what gives it the pleasure. That's why Shaykh Junaid al-Baghdadi used to say, بِصَفَّ الطَّعْمِ وَالْمَسْكَنِ يَصْلُحُ الْأَمْرَ كُلُّهُ. That it's with the purity of food and residence, where you stay. It's not somebody else's property, it's your own property, in the sense that you are rightful to stay there. This is a big problem in many places. There's these land problems, inheritance problems, and people are sitting in what belongs to somebody else. It's a massive problem. So he says, if somebody has purity of food and residence, then all their matters would become straight. That's the barakah of it, that it will actually help you become straight. I think one of the biggest things we're dealing with today is that even when it comes to alcohol issues and stuff like that, and pork and gelatin, I don't think anybody can say that they have never consumed any part of the pig, because of the amount of things it's used in. You know, all the way from the filter of apple juice is made from some aspect of the pig. Right now it's a different issue of whether it goes through, and there's a whole discussion trying to determine how to deal with that. So that's why cloudy apple juice is the best. But there's things like this, simple things that we don't even know. Because that's the fitna. The pig is so versatile that it's used in everything. And that's just far-fetched stuff. I mean, there's other things. It's so easy because sometimes they don't have to mention certain ingredients. But it's unavoidable. We just pray to Allah that Allah overlook that for us. Because if He was to go according to the strict criteria of these mashayikh, what they're saying, I mean, we're not going to get anywhere. The next thing he talks about is bad company. Avoiding bad company. That has a very detrimental effect. So just as we don't want to put anything haram in our stomach, we don't want that association as much as possible. We need to avoid it. Now the thing is that most of us, we work in non-Muslim environments, right? And there's sometimes, even within Muslims, you know, there's a lot of swearing. There's just a lot of deceptive talk, maybe discussion of haram, discussion of cheating, whatever the case is. Now the thing is that you're going to have to work. Now we need to obviously be trying to look for a work situation that is very conducive. But it's not easy for everybody to come along with that. So just practically speaking, we want to try to be able to go in and understand this is work. I do what I have to do. I avoid any kind of unnecessary interaction, unnecessarily benefiting from any wrongs that may be going on or being influenced by them. And then I have to go and wash up. So I have to go and do some extra dhikr or something like that. So there has to be some kind of balance. If there's a thought in here as to like this is going to negatively affect me. I'm in this company. But then you have to also be careful that it doesn't lead to you becoming aggressive in that situation. That's the difficulty of this life today in the Western countries. The difficulty is, how do you dislike something that is haram, but it doesn't lead you to aggression, nor does it lead you to absolute acquiescence and comfort? Because physically we can't change much. You're working with a person with a sexual deviancy. Example. You know what I mean by sexual deviancy. Now, what are you supposed to do in that situation? I mean, personally, I think it's a bit worse, although it's as similar as working with somebody who's in a haram relationship. Right? 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when haram relationships became a bit more open and allowed and it became less of a taboo, the Muslims probably felt the same way. Right? You would never have children who were illegitimate before, but now you do, and it's the norm, and it's quite fine. We've pretty much accepted it in a sense, though we dislike it, right? And one is natural, one is not natural, so there is a difference. Clearly there's a difference. But how do you live in this world without, in this country, without becoming aggressive towards somebody like that? Which sometimes can be very detrimental in terms of, because it's against the law to do that. So how do you balance that with also not feeling like it's all fine? That's the biggest challenge for Muslims today, things of that nature. And a simple example is if you watch a movie and there's the clearly haram aspect going on in there of falling in love, romance, we generally become part of that. We kind of become so absorbed in the story that we can start thinking, yeah, go ahead, do that, do this, we become part of the whole plot. What does that say for our iman at that time? It's quite scary to think about these things. So how do you maintain the state of the heart of a believer? Because can we say that we're acting like a believer when we're so absorbed in this? Of course, we shouldn't even be watching this, but I'm saying this is the case where Muslims watch these things and they get so absorbed that they start, because the director, he's going to, the way he makes the movie, he is going to, the way they do it is to attract sympathy for even the villain. The villain, there's sympathy. The way they play the thing, it makes him seem to be the one you must be sympathizing with. Right? Because that's the way of the movie. At the end, the guy's done all this bad in his life, and then after that, he's like the hero at the end. And we just follow that in our mind because we become so absorbed. So how do you deal with that situation where the Prophet ﷺ said that if you can't even think bad of it in your heart, then it means that that's the last part of your iman, mustard seed. These are the real challenges we have on a very subtle level. Because we, being on the path, we have to think of these things. Because these are highly detrimental. But then you can't go into work and it's like, kafir. How are you going to deal with work that way as well? Do you understand? You can think of it inside you, but how are you going to, how do you deal with that? That's a very difficult thing. It's a very detrimental thing. Now this is the very important part here, which is mujahada. So the internal mujahada is against the shaitan. And against the dunya, you have another mujahada. So you have a mujahada against the dunya. It's trying to get into our heart. So the mujahada is not with the dunya, we have to live here. We can't be, but it's about it getting into our heart. So that's our mujahada, number one. And then we have a mujahada with our nafs. And then we have a mujahada with the shaitan. So we have it at 3 levels. Each 3 of these are trying its best to encroach on us and influence us so that it takes us away from the world. Shaitan gives the waswasa in the heart. That's the idea of shaitan. Make you do any sin, whatever it is. Nafs is even a bigger problem, because it comes from where we don't even realize, and it makes things that you need to do this, you need to do that. It gives us a demand inside, and when you've got, it's like, for example, you want to avoid something, but your family always will tell you, no, do it, do it, do it. That becomes much more difficult than some outsider telling you. You feel an obligation towards your family, right? You feel an obligation towards your family. You're like half, should I do it, should I not do it? And then your family say, yeah, do it, do it. So can you imagine that? So if your family is the same kind of thing here, if it's your enemy in this sense, then your enemy is you think it's your friend, because your family is not your enemy. It's easy to get rid of the shaitan, but the nafs, you can only overcome the nafs through mujahada. Shaitan, you can say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, but the nafs, you have to have mujahada. And mujahada means depriving it of its certain things that it wants to do, so that you give it less energy. The more we indulge it, even with halal things, and the biggest example of this is Ramadan. Ramadan is a training ground for this. This is so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kept 30 days of training for this. That's how important it is. Now, He could have made Ramadan the whole year, but then it would have become a different story. But then it's the training that, look, this is the benefit you'll see from this. And you're supposed to carry on some of this afterwards. The only way to do it is to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to overcome the self by depriving it of things. The way to do it, he says, is by eating less. So fasting more. That's how you do it. Getting up more at night to do more tahajjud, because that's going to go against the nafs, because the weird timing that you have to. That's another thing. And walking instead of riding. He considers that even that, for the sake of Allah, to walk somewhere, as opposed to using the car or something like that. He says that in itself also puts some pain on your heart, or on your nafs. And the other thing is to start doing work within the people, which is generally, this is extreme, but which is generally not seen to be very honorable work. Help people in a way that breaks your nafs. Clear up the masjid. Things of that nature, which generally, people who have a lot of self-respect will not do. So this is to put the nafs down, and that will help it. Somebody asked, you've heard of Bayazid Bistami, who was one of the great awliya of the past. Somebody asked him, what was the most difficult thing and burden Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed on you when you were in His path? So he says that, if I tell you, you would not be able to listen. He said, no. Then tell us, okay, what's the least of the burdens that Allah has placed on you? The least of them. If you can't tell us what the biggest one is, what's the least one? So he said, you don't even have the ability to listen to that. He said, the least is, no, they insisted. So he said, when I told my nafs to do ita'ah and to be obedient, and it did not accept, then I humiliated it for one whole year. I punished it for one entire year, not for one day, not for 2 days, but for an entire year. I went against everything my nafs wanted. Then I got it to. So it's like a wild horse which doesn't want to listen. You have to use certain training tactics to it, which is deprivation. That's why some of the ulama, they've mentioned that you could have 1,000 prophets to intercede for you against the nafs. It will be of no benefit. It's just trying to show that the nafs can only be dealt with in one way. So you could have thousands of prophets to intercede for you against your nafs, but usme kuch nahi fayda hoga. Until you don't act yourself, you'll have no benefit. The only way is to humiliate it and to starve it. That's the only way to deal with your nafs. So dhikr etc. helps, but you also need mujahada against the nafs. Dhikr etc. will help you have enough fortitude to struggle with the nafs. So this is a higher level. And generally not going to talk to people about, depriving the nafs except in Ramadan. But the thing is that we get them into dhikr because there's no way you can even think of depriving yourself. You love your nafs too much. How can we deprive our nafs? The only way we can do that is when we do enough dhikr so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes foremost in our mind. We begin to love Him. We see the need for such a thing. Then we'll have enough strength to do that. And Maulana Shah Wali Thanvi rahmatullahi, he was a master in these things, as our mashayikh were. So when Qari Tayyib Sahib came to him, Maulana Shah Wali Thanvi told him, the biggest people used to come then, Sayyid Sulaiman, Nadwi, Abdul Majid, Daryabadi, all of these great people used to come. So when Qari Tayyib Sahib came, he told him to straighten the shoes. Now Qari Tayyib Sahib is the Muhtamim of Darul Deoband. There's no greater institution than that at the time. So he is the principal. He comes into Maulana Shah Wali Thanvi. Maulana Shah Wali Thanvi tells him that you must straighten people's shoes tomorrow. So that's the kind of thing they used to employ in those days. Today, if you tell murids to do that, we'd never do something like this if our shaykh told us to do that. So Qari Tayyib, he was very refined. He found it very difficult to do. So then it was the shaykh's order, so he had to do it. So what he did was he went and started. The next day he did straighten some shoes, but the nicer ones. He didn't touch the. Remember, in those days, people are coming from the fields. Tanabaun is a village. So there's people coming from the fields all dirty, tatty, and they've been sewn up so many times, and that's the kind of slipper. He didn't want to touch them. He only touched the good ones, and he straightened those up. So Maulana Shaitan noticed it. So tomorrow he says, tomorrow I want you to just focus on those ones and not that one. So when he did that the next day, now that it was appointed, order, when he later recounts that when I did that, all the arrogance from my heart disappeared. I humiliated my nafs. I remember when I went to Tanabawan, the person who was showing us around, Maulana Huzaifa his name is. So there's the Tanabawan Khanqa, and then after that, some distance away, there's a land that Maulana Thanvi used to own, and on there he had built a building. There was a building there that was out in the side of the village, out in the middle of nowhere in a sense. So he said, now it's actually in front of his grave, because he decided to have his grave away from the graveyard of the town. So somebody said, what is this special preparation you're making for your own grave in this special place, and so on? Because it does seem a bit special, doesn't it, if you don't want to be in the general qabristan and you make your own qabristan. But he says, and this is the foresight of the man, he said that I've just rooted out such a big facade that could happen afterwards. Because if he was buried in the general graveyard, it's owned by everybody. You can't have any control there. He's seen the abuse of other mashayikh's graves, where people come and certain groups of people take over and make that a money-making job. Now, if it's on his own, that's run by his family and his madrasa, then they can make sure nothing like that happens. So look at his foresight. Even after his death, he's focused on these things. So now, there's a few other people buried there, but that's it. It's guarded, so you can't go and do these kind of things there. But that's a separate point. The point is about the building. He showed us this old building, just one kind of building, and he said, "Yahan un muridon ko bheja jata tha, jinki islah wahan nahi hoti thi." That basically those who couldn't be rectified in the khanqa, they had to be sent here. And the khanqa is not like some kind of plush, luxurious place anyway. It's quite basic. So if they couldn't be sorted out there, and he goes, Qari Tayyib Sahib ko yahan bheja gaya tha. But these great people were willing to put themselves down to that. I mean, what we're doing here is a joke. We're just about doing something. Allah Ta'ala accepted. If you go and look at Raipur, it's ajib, it's a wonderful place. It's nothing around it. Just in the middle of the forest kind of thing. Nice green all the way around. I remember the first time we went there and there's people doing dhikr there. It was quite amazing. It was quite amazing. Because you can have, in London it's difficult. You're hearing the traffic, you're hearing everything. to have that kind of isolation, to be just focused. Because even the sound of traffic is going to be distracting you. It's going to make you think about where you have to go because we're so used to it. It's just psychological, we can't help it. So we must try to do as much as possible. So he says a few other things, but I'll just basically وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا, that those who really do mujahada in our way for us, who mujahada means to exert yourself in this sense, to exert yourself. Whoever does exert themselves for our way, we will then show them our paths. The paths to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the higher level paths. We're all Muslims, alhamdulillah. We all have a level of tawfiq of doing good deeds. But then the path of Nafsul mutma'inna, those are blocked to us until we don't do mujahada. Otherwise our nafs will constantly stay in lawama, ammara situation. We're constantly going to be in this turmoil. The way to get there is to do more mujahada. But the thing I want to just caution is that mujahada has to be done slowly. Because we're not used to it. We've lived lives that are, and if you don't have one is that somebody can take themselves out of life like that and go into a monastic life where everything surrounding you is monastic, right? Like a khanka in the middle of nowhere. And that's what everybody's doing. Nobody's eating good food. Everybody's eating basic food. Then it's easier because your surrounding will help you. But in this country, to go into a monastic life where everything around you is too difficult. It's like, you're taking a child, putting him in front of all these ice cream parlors and not buying him an ice cream. You're torturing yourself then. So that's why one has to work slowly on this. One has to work slowly within the confines of what we have. That's why it's difficult, otherwise it will backfire and you'll lose your nafs again. Right? So I'm not trying to tell people not to do it, but I'm just trying to say that we need to do it slowly. And if the desire is there and the will is there and you are making small increments each time, then inshallah at least we're getting somewhere. So the thing is to make that improvement bit by bit, at least. And if one day Allah Ta'ala does give us an ability, and it's very difficult for people to go away, but if we can go away for a while, and then that would be very beneficial, because that does help us. It's like having a few Ramadans throughout the year to find a situation like that. Unfortunately, many of the i'tikafs that we do, there's good food in those i'tikafs. There's all of that. So at the end of the day, what do you end up really getting out of the i'tikaf except feeling good? You get some benefit, but it's not the same thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala benefit us.